U.S. President Donald Trump announced a 10% tariff on Canadian energy.
Could Canada help replace Russian raw materials and even some of its energy deliveries to Germany?
With the West shunning Russian energy, LNG suppliers worldwide scramble to make up the shortfall. One of those countries is Qatar, which has been making long-term supply deals with European and Asian partners and recently announced that it expects to sign more contracts this year.
A 10% tariff on Canada's natural gas and energy sector, just one announcement. But President Trump has triggered an explosion that has changed the global energy landscape, inadvertently igniting a spectacular flip-flop that has rocked America's energy position. Not only Canada, but even before Washington had time to regroup after announcing tariffs on 180 countries, Qatar simultaneously redirected its gas exports straight to Europe. Imagine those massive pipelines, instead of flowing to Texas or New York, now eagerly converging on Germany, France, and even the United Kingdom, opening up a new era of cooperative alliances. Now what will Washington do when the allies who once sailed in the same boat suddenly turn their back? Could a new tariff counterattack to Canada and Qatar force Trump to change his mind? Let's uncover the answers in today's video. And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our latest updates. At the beginning of 2025, Trump decided to impose a 10% tariff on crude oil and gas imported from Canada. Immediately after his second inauguration, the Trump administration inadvertently ignited an unprecedented crisis in energy relations between the two countries. According to Reuters, Canada accounted for nearly 50% of the total crude oil imported by the United States, estimated at up to 4 million barrels per day. But starting in March 2025, this entire energy supply suddenly faced a tariff equal to 1/10 of its value, a move that completely distorted the rules of the game that had existed for decades between the two sides. This decision not only dealt a blow to U.S. refining companies struggling with a shortage of cheap and stable supplies, but it also forced Ottawa to seek a new harbor for millions of barrels of gas each day, as the United States was consuming 90% of Canada's oil exports. Instead of flowing to Texas or Louisiana as before, Canadian liquefied natural gas, or LNG, exports are now being redirected to Europe, where countries are racing to stockpile in order to deal with the post-Russia energy crisis. The IEA recorded that in the first quarter of 2025, Europe's LNG imports surged by 23% year-on-year, equivalent to over 9 billion cubic meters of additional gas. At the same time, Qatar, a giant that has long quietly held the world's lowest LNG export costs, quickly jumped into the gap. According to Reuters, Doha is planning to expand capacity from 77 million tons per year to 142 million tons by 2030, an increase of nearly 85% in order to boost exports to Europe and Asia. This move shows that Qatar is not only observing but also proactively seizing the opportunity presented by the U.S. tariff shock to elevate its position, forcing Washington to reassess its energy strategy and its traditional alliances with long-standing partners. From the initial tariff package to the wave of global energy realignment, the backdrop of this dispute has gradually revealed a new geopolitical gamble where economic interests and strategic power are being reshaped by the hour. In mid-2025, when the 10% tariff on all natural gas imports from Canada officially took effect, Washington did not anticipate that this would be the jolt initiating an unprecedented strategic turning point in the North American energy sector. At that time, the United States was the sole outlet for Canada's gas. According to data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Canada exported about 8.66 billion cubic feet per day via pipeline to the U.S. in 2024, up from 8.0 billion cubic feet per day in 2023, and an average of 7.5 billion cubic feet per day over the previous 5 years, 2018 to 2022. That compares with the record 10.4 BCFD reached in 2002. Suddenly, this volume, nearly half of U.S. refinery and power plant demand, became more expensive, forcing Ottawa to seek an escape toward Europe and Asia. This wasn't merely a unilateral punishment of an ally. Trump also appeared to be sending an indirect signal, striking back after trade tensions with China. Wasting no time, Canada accelerated the LNG Canada project at Kitimat, British Columbia. It's their first liquefied natural gas export facility, with a capacity of 14 million tons of LNG per year, and a first shipment slated for mid-2025. The project is Ottawa's trump card to recoup losses and expand into European and Asian markets. Images of giant LNG carriers leaving Port Kitimat have become emblematic of Canada's energy pivot, but this strategy extends far beyond a single new plant. Canada is expanding its entire infrastructure network, from the 670-kilometer Coastal GasLink pipeline to ports and storage facilities, with the goal of escaping the U.S. market. The CAD 40 billion pipeline, capable of carrying 2 billion cubic feet per day, now links the Montney gas fields directly to the export terminal, allowing Canada to sell straight to distant customers without crossing the U.S. border. The impact was immediate. The flow of cheap gas to the U.S. began to shrink, driving gasoline prices in eastern states up by 20 to 40 cents per gallon in the first month of the tariff. According to industry experts and distributors, thousands of workers at refineries, ports, and processing plants felt the squeeze. Most notably, Stellantis halted production and laid off 900 workers at its Windsor, Michigan facility alone due to higher import costs for parts and fuel. That figure has since climbed to 4,500. Never has a seemingly small tariff decision triggered such a sweeping flip. Canada has shown remarkable agility in turning crisis into opportunity, while the U.S. now faces a wrenching dilemma: how to maintain energy stability and protect millions of jobs when a protective policy has inadvertently induced shortages and price spikes. What do you think of Trump's decision against Canada? Leave your thoughts in the comments below so we can discuss further. While Canada is pivoting its energy strategy, Qatar is not standing still. From exporting 77 million tons of LNG per year in 2024, Doha has already laid out a roadmap to boost capacity to 142 million tons by 2030, an increase of nearly 85% in just the next 6 years. This lies at the heart of the North Field expansion project, the engine that will propel Qatar to become the global LNG superpower, ready to command almost 25% of the world market by the end of this decade. And Qatar isn't stopping at raw capacity figures. It has proactively signed long-term contracts with a host of European giants. In October 2023, Qatar Energy and Total Energies inked a 27-year deal to supply 3.5 million tons of LNG per year to France, running from 2026 through the mid-2050s. Just days later, Doha sealed another 27-year agreement with Shell in the Netherlands for 2 million tons annually. Decisive moves aimed at replacing Russian gas at a time when the EU is still scrambling for alternatives, in fact. Europe's demand for liquefied gas is surging. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, forecasts that EU LNG imports will climb by 25% in 2025. That's an extra 33 billion cubic meters year on year, pushing volumes close to record level highs. The main driver is the sharp drop in piped Russian supply after flows through Nord Stream and other pipelines nearly halted, forcing Europe to make up the shortfall with imported LNG. At the same time, storage needs have spiked. End-of-winter inventories were only 34% full, so tanks must be replenished to 90% capacity before next winter to ensure adequate heating for European households. However, Qatar's deals face headwinds from the EU's new stringent environmental rules, such as the Due Diligence Directive, which mandates that gas suppliers meet carbon and human rights standards, and new reporting requirements are coming in 2027. These regulations have put Doha in a leveraged position. It's ready to invoke exemptions or even threaten to halt supplies if heavily penalized, all to preserve its reputation for low-cost, reliable deliveries. Even as the U.S. government ramps up its own LNG exports to reclaim market share, domestic infrastructure lags. Pipelines and export terminals remain inadequate. At CERAWeek in March 2025, industry leaders warned that without more large-scale pipelines and deep-water ports, U.S. export capacity will bottleneck despite the highest demand in 15 years. Moreover, the 2 new U.S. LNG plants aren't due online until 2026 to 2027, meaning European buyers will have to wait or turn to Qatar as the fast alternative for at least the next 2 years. In the race for Europe's energy business, Qatar not only enjoys the world's lowest production costs but also wins the trade war of words, consistently extending long-term partnership offers. Meanwhile, Washington faces domestic energy security pressures and slight price upticks at home due to export competition. Qatar, with its unrivaled position, is proving it can do more than just plug the Russian gas gap. It's the hunter seizing opportunity while the U.S. scrambles to build its capacity. When Europe was faced with an unprecedented geopolitical turning point, the region hurriedly sought sustainable alternatives. The main gas pipeline from Russia through Ukraine was shut off because Ankara and Moscow did not renew the agreement. This event drove Russia's share of the EU's total gas supply from 40% before the conflict to below 10% in just a few months. Member states were forced to sign long-term contracts with Ottawa and Doha to fill the energy gap. With the mindset of ensuring no more cold winters, Brussels swiftly targeted liquefied natural gas projects from Canada and Qatar. A recent draft by the European Commission revealed a plan to invest directly in LNG export facilities abroad in order to secure a stable supply, despite high costs and political risks. Canada, via the LNG Canada project, and Qatar, through its massive contracts with Total Energies, Shell, and others, have become new pillars providing the EU with a solid energy shield for at least the next 2 decades. No longer merely a commodity, LNG has now become a powerful diplomatic tool. Qatar has exploited all of the EU's environmental exemptions to export at competitive prices, while Canada has leveraged its G7 ally status to negotiate favorable terms. According to the IEA, the flow of LNG into Europe now accounts for over 35% of total gas imports, and the bloc is considering building a 20 billion cubic meters strategic reserve to minimize disruption risks. Meanwhile, American consumers, even though the U.S. is viewed as a winner in the global LNG market, are bearing the direct consequences. Domestic natural gas prices have risen nearly 80% year-on-year, primarily due to record volumes being funneled to LNG export terminals and the knock-on effects of the Trump administration's tariff policy. The result has been heating and electricity bills in many eastern states soaring by hundreds of dollars each cold season. As Washington pushes exports to assert its position, domestic infrastructure from pipelines to ports lags behind, creating the paradox that despite being an energy superpower, Americans remain anxious about prices and supply stability from the 10% tariff. On Canadian gas to the new energy map redrawn by Canada and Qatar, the U.S. now faces a brutal quandary: how to balance global economic interests with the immediate well-being of millions of American families. Should President Trump really reconsider his punitive tariffs in light of these unfolding consequences borne not by foreign rivals but by his own citizens? Since Canada and Qatar simultaneously have exploited the LNG backdoor to evade pressure from Washington, the United States is increasingly at risk of becoming isolated on the global energy map. Previously, America's position in Europe's liquefied natural gas market was rock solid. In 2024, the U.S. held a 45% share of LNG exports to the European Union, serving as the primary supplier for many countries on the old continent. However, everything changed dramatically in the first few months of 2025. Brussels, the EU's energy policy coordination hub, did not hesitate to sign a series of long-term contracts with Ottawa and Doha. These commitments not only guarantee Europe a stable supply but also mark a watershed. The EU no longer disperses its dependencies across Washington, Berlin, Paris, but is building a brand new competitive energy lane separate from the old system. Against this backdrop, the U.S.'s unilateral tariff policy has backfired severely. When competitively priced gas from Canada and Qatar flooded European ports, U.S. natural gas futures spiked 8% in March 2025, reaching nearly $4 per million British thermal units, the largest jump in years. That surge coincided with record volumes flowing into U.S. LNG export terminals, pulling supply away from the domestic market and driving retail prices upward. As a result, American consumers have faced soaring heating bills and electricity costs, while eastern states have seen gas prices at the pump climb to unprecedented highs. In response, Washington has been forced to hasten the expansion of its domestic infrastructure. Gas storage facilities and pipeline systems already running at capacity must now be scaled up, and LNG export terminals are being prioritized for upgrades to handle record volumes. Simultaneously, the U.S. government is negotiating urgently with Brussels to lift certain methane regulation barriers, aiming to reclaim its export position in the European market in the near term. Most strikingly, LNG in this race has evolved into a strategic diplomatic instrument far beyond its purely commercial role. The Qatari government is ready to leverage every EU environmental exemption and tariff incentive to keep its export prices at rock-bottom levels. Meanwhile, Canada relies on its G7 ally prestige and long-standing diplomatic ties to negotiate highly flexible terms, prompting European nations to sign agreements lasting up to 2 decades. Thanks to these levers, both Ottawa and Doha have secured significant negotiating advantages, while the U.S. faces pressure to choose between domestic consumer interests and its ambition to consolidate a global leadership position. This shift in energy power also paints a complex picture for the future. A broader picture of U.S. geostrategy on one hand, Washington seeks to protect domestic production through tariffs. On the other, it must maintain strategic influence and energy security for its traditional allies. As Canada and Qatar forge closer ties with the European Union, the U.S. is losing its influence over global gas prices and flows, and risks isolation even on its own home turf. For this reason, the future of U.S. energy policy is shrouded in uncertainty. Will Washington continue its hardline stance, protecting its domestic industry at the expense of global influence? Or will it soon pivot, expand multilateral dialogue, promote joint infrastructure investment, and roll back some protectionist measures to regain its leading edge? The answer will determine whether America remains an energy superpower or is left behind in the new global energy game. After a series of unilateral tariff measures, starting with a 10% levy on Canadian gas, a global energy shock has reverberated around the world. Rather than preserving its monopoly, Washington inadvertently triggered a major pivot. Ottawa and Doha moved quickly to sign multi-decade contracts with the EU, filling a 33 billion cubic meter gap left by cut Russian pipelines and driving EU LNG imports up by an expected 25% in 2025. From minor players, Canada and Qatar have risen to become new pillars, rewriting the rules and ushering in a competitive energy lane alongside the United States. Under such pressure, the very tariffs meant to protect American consumers have backfired. Domestic gas prices have surged nearly 80%, forcing millions of U.S. households to pay hundreds of extra dollars each cold season, while export infrastructure, from storage terminals to ports, lags behind the pace of international demand. Meanwhile, Canada and Qatar leverage their EU relationships to keep export prices competitive, turning LNG into a potent diplomatic tool. Now Washington stands between two conflicting imperatives. It must shield domestic consumers and jobs through protectionist policies, yet also uphold its leadership in the global energy market to avoid isolation. My view is that the U.S. should soon adjust its policy direction. First, gradually reduce trade barriers with close allies like Canada, while expanding public-private partnerships to invest heavily in domestic LNG infrastructure, storage, ports, and pipelines. Second, pursue market diversification by negotiating flexible bilateral agreements with European and Asian partners, balancing economic interests with strategic alliances. Third, accelerate the clean energy transition using LNG revenues to fund green infrastructure, thereby reducing long-term fossil fuel dependence and boosting competitiveness. Only by combining moderate protectionism, robust infrastructure investment, and international cooperation can Washington reverse its trailing position and reclaim the locomotive role in the global energy arena. In today's complex geostrategic landscape, this is the key to ensuring that both the U.S. and its allies are not left behind. What do you think? Leave your comments below and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our latest analysis videos.